Thanks for tuning in to My Valley, His Victory, hosted by me, Mackenzie Smith, where I interview Christians who love the outdoors and have walked through valleys in their lives. In a world of highlight reels and surface-level relationships, we all have faced hardships. I believe our experiences can be encouraging to others if we have the courage to be vulnerable. 2 Corinthians 1 says, "The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." My goal is to inspire you to come to the Creator through His creation and connect you with Christians who have been through similar experiences. I pray that this podcast encourages you if you are in a valley and pushes you to share how God has turned your past valley into His victory. I have a very special announcement this week. I am thrilled to announce that I will be hosting a few women's retreats later this year, along with my friend Audrey from the Trail North. From Thursday to Sunday, we'll dive into Christ-centered community with many workshops, worship, bonfire, s'mores, and so much more to challenge you to grow in every area of your life. Email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com for more information or for the registration link. Spots are limited, so reserve yours today. On today's episode of My Valley, His Victory, we have Stacey Szczepanski. She is the author of the newly released book titled Unlocking Love: How Being Catfished Deepened My Faith and Led Me on a Journey to Wholeness. Stacey is a former classroom teacher and now finds joy in being a literacy coach. She enjoys traveling, being out in nature, and taking time to enjoy God's little blessings. Through her healing journey, Stacey has grown her relationship with God, recognizes singleness as a gift, and loves meeting new people. Thanks so much for being with us today, Stacey.
Hi, thanks for having me, Kenzie. I'm super excited to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you on and so excited to hear you talk about your story. And I know I gave the listeners a little bit about you already, but if you want to go ahead and just share a little bit more about yourself and who you are.
Yeah. Well, I'm Stacey Szczepanski. I'm me. I don't know. You pretty much summed everything up. And I have a story. And I guess I want to start off with even just how God has connected you and I, Kenzie. I think it was Christian Outdoor Collective. Yes. And I saw your post and you putting out that you were going to do a podcast and listen, not just hear, but listen to God's calling in that. And so in the short amount of time that we've known each other, I've just loved seeing your growth in this process that He has given you, and you're following what He's saying. And I say that because that is part of my story. And that part of my story has been pretty recent, like within the last, I would say, 3.5 years. I just recently released Unlocking Love exactly 2 weeks ago. And it might bring some emotions up because it was such a whirlwind when I have spent 7.5 years with this on my heart. God clearly spoke this into me. And it wasn't until about 3.5 years ago that I started writing it. And my arms are open to everything that He has moving forward. And I'm just so excited to see where His journey continues to take me.
Thank you so much for that word of encouragement, and also just for being open and willing to share your story. I think that, that's really the heart behind this podcast is I think we all have things that we go through in life. And I think that we all have things that we can help others with. And I know, in your situation specifically, this is something that not very many people go through. And so providing a resource for someone who may be going through the same thing is really, I think, at the bottom of your heart and at the bottom of my heart in kind of why you wrote the book and why I'm doing this podcast. And so I just also want to say thank you for writing it and for listening to God's calling in your life, because I think it's going to help so many. And not even, I think, with maybe even the way the whole thing started, which, is the crux of the book of how being catfished, deepened your love and led you on a journey of wholeness. But I think that you write about so much about relationships and about being in tune with yourself and seeking things that you really want in other people. And so I think that even if someone has never been catfished, I know I can't relate to that, but man, I related to so much of what you said in the book. And I think that you talk a lot about love and the way in which we grow up and why we do certain things and why we react certain ways and how to navigate that. And I think anyways, it's going to be a beautiful resource for a lot of people. So we'll go ahead and say it here, guys. If you have not bought or heard of the book Unlocking Love, go check it out on Amazon or on Stacey's Instagram. We'll link it in the show notes for you to get. But just a really awesome book, and I'm excited to hear more about it. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later, but let's chat a little bit about let's start in the outdoors. How do you recreate outdoors, and what does getting outdoors look like for you?
Oh, well, I write about this in the book too. Of part 3 is about discovering my identity. And last night I actually went to a musical called Pilgrim, and it's based on the book Pilgrim's Progress. I think that's the title of it, by John Bunyan. And I have not read the book, but it was so beautifully well done. And it was about the being on the narrow path that we as Christians, and I say that a little bit lightly, just because we all have different views of Christianity as well, and depending on where we are in our journey. But that was the beauty of this musical, was the enemy is continuously trying to get us off this narrow path that God has us on. And so I look back, and when I truly believe COVID was a blessing in disguise for many different reasons. It was a lot, but that is really where I started going outside and outdoors more. That's all I could really do. I am single. I live by myself, and I live right by a nature center. So I always just went out, and I'm going to get emotional, but I just feel God's presence in nature. He's our creator of this beautiful space and this beautiful world. And that's kind of what started me loving the outdoors. And I just posted on my Instagram, one of my Instagram stories this past week, of with it being the transition into winter and literally going into hibernation mode, I feel like my body was just yearning for being outside. There's a difference when I'm outside. I feel God's presence even more strongly. And that's kind of part 3 around my story, is I started taking more adventures outside. And I write about going to different parks and different places. Any travels that I did after COVID too, I went hiking a lot. And I talk about one part of this. I just talk about, so last night in the Pilgrim musical, part of the story was about Christian, the character, was going on his journey, and he came to the Mountain of Delight. That's what it was called. And there were fellow believers around, and they were looking out, explaining the Mountain of Delight. And I connected it to when I went to Camelback Mountain in Scottsdale one spring break. And I write about, so in here I have, little did I know what I was about to experience. Imagine large boulders, rough surfaces, no easy way up, and challenges every step of the way. The Lord knew I was up for the challenge. I could conquer this rocky mountain just as I had every other rocky part in my life. I was not in a rush. I walked, I jumped on and off boulders, crawling my way at certain points. I encouraged others as I passed them, or when I was struggling to catch my breath on the way to the next stopping point. I stopped to snap photos, some far off the well-traveled path. I was surrounded by mountains, cacti, bees, desert, and hot air, and by the time I got to the top, the morning sun was shining brightly, almost like God's victory light celebrating that I had made it. As I stood on a large boulder while setting the self-timer to capture photos depicting the strength I was feeling, I looked out and saw a world that only God could have created. I was in awe at how high up I was, looking at the world below me, where everything looked miniature. This was the true definition of a bird's eye view. And then I explained, at one point in my climb, I remember looking up and seeing people the size of ants moving up the mountain in front of me. I felt the same way when I looked down the mountain at the houses and miles of the unknown. As I sat there taking in the view in both directions, I thought about how small we truly are in this world. And so that, even just those couple paragraphs, are a depiction for me of we're always going to be on the climb, and looking around and seeing all that God has created, it truly fills me. And I tend to just go in nature. And that's part of the adventure, is you don't know where that next path is going to go when you're climbing up a mountain. I was just in Ireland this past summer, and I went with a friend, and it was rainy. I think that was the day. It was maybe a little rainy, and we kept climbing up, and she wanted to turn back. But I said, no, let's just keep going. As soon as we got a little bit closer, it opened up to this hidden lake. And if you stop, we would have never seen that. Sorry. It just reminds me, and I want to remind others, like, nature is created by God. You have to get out in it. You have to be brave and explore. But yeah, I don't even remember what the question was, but that's where I find God, is in nature. And I know, just knowing you for what I do, Kenzie, for this short amount of time, seeing you in nature, I know you connect to that.
Yeah, I think it's important what you said as you were reading your book. One of the lines that stood out is, as you were on this climb and as you were really struggling and, just trying to get up this mountain, out of breath, jumping boulder to boulder, trying to navigate your own journey, you were still cheering others along. And so I think that that's just like a really important word for a lot of people, is, just being able to never stop encouraging others, even when you're struggling. That was what I really took out of when I read that part. Yeah. Even though that seems hard and it seems, like others should be helping you, there's still always a place, I think, for you to help others. And I think it's beautiful what you said about the Ireland trip and about going up and it being rainy and being cloudy and being just ugly. And it kind of, reminds me of a train going through a tunnel. Like, we know there's light at the end of the tunnel, right? And I think a lot of times we stop when things get hard or when things aren't what we think they're supposed to be. And it's like, man, I think that's just a picture of what God has in store for us. He's like, if you just keep walking in obedience, like, I'm going to show you something that you never even could have imagined.
100%.
And the sky opening up, just, I've had that experience happen as well in hiking and, thinking, oh man, we're doing this really hard hike and it's a crappy day and I'm not going to get to see the view that I want to. But then usually there's at least a second or two, if you're paying attention, where you can see what you went to see.
I actually call those penny moments in the book as well. One of my closest friends had heard that and told me about it, and I can't get enough of that. And so in the book, I talk about penny moments because it's those little moments. And just like pennies, when you add them up, they become great, become great wealth. And so it is those little moments along the way that we build. And that's the life we create for ourselves too, and that God has for us.
Yeah. And I know you already answered this a little bit, but my next question was going to be, how do you connect to God in the outdoors? And I think you've already touched on that a little bit, but is this something that, you would say COVID taught you, or is this something that has been in your life?
Oh, that's a good question. I look back and again, the book, my story, I kind of start with the event of being catfished, but then like you mentioned, Kenzie, that I go into what kind of led up to that, like my childhood, my different experiences. So I look back, and nature has always been an important part of my life. And I just think of, even as a kid, I was always outside. My dad always built in the wintertime this gigantic snow slide in our backyard, just being outside and being in the fresh air. So I don't do this anymore, but I remember going in the woods with my dad and my brother. They're big hunters. And so, yeah, I think it's always been a part of me. And as growing up, my parents took my brother and I out west and did a lot of camping. And it's those moments that as a kid you don't think about, but it's now as an adult that you think, oh man, those were amazing experiences that you take for granted. Granted, you're also a kid, but I just feel blessed and lucky that we were able to do that.
Yeah, and I really related to the book and the part about, I don't know if you've read my blog or not at all, but my blog, is about analogies of things in nature that relate to our walk with God or things of that nature. And in one of the very first chapters, you talked about this moment where you were near a stream at a park and how you could relate so much to the stream because you had a stream of emotions flowing through you. And I think that that's, one of the reasons why nature can be so healing is because we can see ourselves and we can see direct pictures of what we're going through in nature.
Yes. Yeah, I like that connection. And you have to take the time, and maybe will ask you if you feel the same way, of taking the time to allow yourself to be still enough to feel those moments.
100%. I talk about that. I feel like I've covered that maybe in a few of these podcasts already, but I think that is the key thing that nature provides or can provide to anyone who struggles connecting with God, because there are way less distractions out in nature than there are in our everyday life. And so we can actually be aware and be present enough to focus on those things and to even hear from God. I think that we're not quite designed to live in the world that we live in and with all of the distractions and all of the things. And so I think that that's one of the key things that I take from nature is having that slow down, no distractions. A lot of times I don't have cell phone service, so that takes away my main distraction.
Yeah. But even that, I mean, just yesterday I went for a walk and I didn't take my cell phone. Because even just having it there, it's that temptation. And I have done this devotional book. It's 40 days. It's a social media fast for 40 days. And one of the chapters is about the apple. And it talks about Adam and Eve.
Yep.
But Wendy Speak is the author of that devotional. And she talks about, if you look at your app, if you have an Apple iPhone, the apple, there's a bite cut out of it. So it's meant to tempt you and distract you. So when you leave your phone at home, you have nothing really to do that. That is a materialistic thing in your hand. And I oftentimes, there's a tree by me that I just get so filled. And a lot of times when I'm there, I'll just touch it, just touching what God has created and just thinking of how long that tree has been on this earth and the stories it has. Yeah, but again, you have to allow yourself to open up and let those moments come to you as well.
Definitely. I like what you said about putting your hands and actually touching things. And, there's the whole aspect of grounding. And there's a reason we feel more at ease in nature. And I think that that's just really important. Taking intentional time away from your phone, leaving it at home, going out in nature, not allowing that distraction.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a really big part of my story, and that I share in the book too, of I grew up, my generation just we didn't grow up with cell phones. And so, but I talk about how I remember when we got our first box computer and our first car phone. And I'm an educator, so I see what technology is doing. There's a lot of good in technology, but that is also part of my story and part of why I feel called to share, not just with women, but men. There's been multiple men who have bought my book, and also parents. It's scary. Technology can be scary. And that's what I share about my catfishing experience. So people are aware. I just truly believe that it's not talked about as much as it should be. And that is part of my story moving forward, is trying to get this message out there and knowing that people are, and reminding people that they are not alone in this, but also letting kids be kids and not having that distraction. I just see it so often and it just scares me.
No, I think that that's important because we do live in a world with so much technology, and I think it's ever evolving. And I think back to even when, I first got a computer, or whenever, I was younger, I kind of grew up where in the age of, we kind of started to get cell phones around the time we started driving, and, 15 years old. And thinking back to some of those things where you could, just like today, you could find random people online and you can just do whatever you want. So I guess at this point, this seems like a really good segue to talk about, your valley, and make the transition into actually talking about what you experienced and kind of what this book is about and what God taught you through this season. And just I know we've been kind of rummaging around it a little bit, but yeah, let's dive into it.
Yeah. Well, I was catfished.
All right. So for someone who doesn't know what that means, why don't we give them a little bit of information?
Yes, that is usually my next question to people when I tell them about the book is, do you know what being catfished is? And it's been interesting because depending on the generation you are, I'm seeing a range of if people know or not. And so being catfished I knew of it because I watched, there's a MTV show called Catfished on MTV. And I watched that in high school, maybe beginning of college. So I knew this. And actually that TV show helped me surface everything 7.5 years ago. So being catfished means you are basically talking to someone who portrays themselves to be someone that they're not. And what happens is it can become a manipulative relationship, quote unquote. A lot of gaslighting can take place nowadays too. And this was a thing when everything surfaced, and I had met my life coach 2 days after, and she kept telling me, Stacey, you're safe and you have all your money. And I didn't understand that at first because a lot of times these scams, they request money. So I don't know. And I still to this day do not know who this person is, but there was so much. I knew there were a lot of red flags. I could feel it. People around me were concerned, but I was not ready to face it. And so depending on what they were saying, I had an excuse, or I try to protect and defend this relationship that was all a lie. And so I go into how I found things out. And ultimately, when I was writing this book, okay, let me step back. So the day I found everything out and surfaced, so I literally, part of me figuring it out is I thought of the MTV show Catfish, and Neve usually on his show will put pictures into Google image search. And that's what I did. And so you'll have to read more to find that person or all that out. But I remember when everything surfaced, God clearly spoke to me. He's spoken to me this clearly 3 times in my life. And that was the first time. And he said, Stacey, you're going to write a book someday for others to feel less alone, because I felt so alone during that time. And there was so much shame, and I didn't know how to navigate all of that. But I'm also a person that goes full force into the next thing. So in my head, I was like, okay, well, I got to figure out my life now. I have to keep moving forward. But ultimately, when I was writing this story, I'm a journaler, and I reread all my journals. And the thing that really surfaced, one of the things is I talk about and write about my gut a lot. And it wasn't until just a few years ago when I was reading through these that I I felt and know now that my gut is the Holy Spirit that was always talking to me. And so a couple of years ago in 2021, I committed to listening to my gut the first time rather than the second or third or fourth time when I try to take control. So a lot, part one and even part two, it's about navigating relationships after this deception and rebuilding myself and getting closer to Jesus. I was raised Catholic and I've always had a strong connection to faith, but I knew there was something missing. And I know now that it wasn't something, it was someone, and it was my relationship with Jesus. And I know, Kenzie, you talk about this on the podcast that you were just on, and I so connect with that. Faith is so much more than just a religious go to church and do all the legalistic stuff. I mean, I do go to church because I do get filled, but it's not who I go to constantly. And that's really God and Jesus. And so I write about just really building my relationship. I had 2 serious relationships after the catfishing experience. And I even now look back and I think, oh, my brokenness and my hurt, I was trying to get it filled by someone else and not God first. And those relationships didn't work. And it wasn't until my last boyfriend 3.5 years ago, he's a Christian, he's a good guy, relationship was good. Like there was nothing wrong, but there was just something and I couldn't keep going. And I started to read the Bible more. I started to dig deeper. My relationship grew. I started to be outdoors more and I felt him and I continued. I know that nudge and I pray often. And some of you might be listening and because I was this person years ago of like, I just want to hear God's voice. People say they hear God's voice. Like, what's that like? But hearing God's voice to me, I've discovered is hearing his voice, but also like he could talk through a friend of yours or just being present. But it's something, and that's what faith is. It's something you can't see. And someone had said, maybe it was you. Did you say faith is the opposite of sight? Someone said that.
Wasn't me.
Okay. But I liked that because it is. A faith is the opposite of sight. It is the unseen, but you have that belief that there is someone more. There's something more out there for us. That was very long-winded.
Hey, that's what this is all about. It's all about you just sharing. I think that's really valuable. And I think that there's a lot of things that we talk about on this podcast and about how a lot of relationships that we go through kind of pull us away from our relationship with God. And it's like so many people, I think, get stuck in singleness and feel like they're at a loss and that they're not where they should be. But I think that one of the most important things you can do, and you talked a little bit about this in your book, is spending the time to actually be with God without distractions like we were talking about, so that then when you're ready to go into a relationship, you are standing on a much more solid ground, and you have less negotiables than you maybe did before. So like I loved reading the book and seeing your list of like what you wanted in a man before all of this, and then seeing what you wanted after you had gone through some hard times, because I think that hard times always put into perspective in a way like what is the most important thing. And I think that, you know, in your first list, there were character traits, and I just giggled a little bit because this is just so typical. But, you know, I want him to be 6'2" or taller. And I'm just, you know,
I'm 5'11", so yeah, that would be nice.
And so I laugh at that because, a lot of people, whenever they're like just dreaming of people, they're like, oh yeah, I want this. And I want them to have blue eyes and brown hair. And, there are all these physical traits. But then I feel like your list towards the end was truly just like, I want someone who sees my heart. Like it reminded me a lot of God. Like all of the things that you said were things that I think that God can do for us too. And it's like, God's not 6'2" and God's not, other things, but looking for that, and just reading those things, it definitely showed that you were in a much, I will say, healthier mindset and actually focusing on what's important. One of the things that I love most about your book is you talk about that whenever, and this is a direct quote from your book, there are moments in your life when everything around you seems to come crashing down. What do you do when this happens? You have a choice to make. Do you sit in the rubble or do you get back up and start to rebuild piece by piece? I chose to rebuild, and the process started the very next day. And I think that is such an encouraging word, because I do think that a lot of times whenever something happens, we just sit and we sulk and we just feel so defeated. And I think that, that's part of the grieving process, right? We're going to cry. We're going to feel like crap. It's going to happen. But I think that what you choose to do with that fuel and that energy also is so important. And think that you can either decide, like you said, to sit and sulk in it, or you can get up and you can start to rebuild. And so I love that is really what a lot of this book is about, is it's tangible things that we can do to rebuild after whatever intergrief, trauma, betrayal is. You may not relate, directly to being catfished, but I think that, like I said, I related to a whole lot of this book without experiencing this specific thing. And I just love the tangible things to take away from it. And my all-time favorite thing was just that you put your prayers in it. And so I feel like every other page is a prayer. And I think that as Christians, prayer is one of those things that we're not taught super well in how to pray and what it looks like. And so to me, that was very helpful. And I had a lot of underlining, I love this statement of your prayer and just the way in which you phrased it to God. And I think that a lot of them, you can take and you can mimic, they're not, super specific to where you're at. They're, more about betrayal and that sort of thing. But I really love that piece of the book and those little nuggets.
That makes my heart so full for many different reasons to hear that. Because I actually just, under my Christmas tree right now, I have a prayer book, because it's been on my heart to dig a little deeper into my prayer life. Again, being raised Catholic, all of the prayers and things were basically routine in my eyes and memorized. And this has been a journey for me. So my journaling actually has evolved into talking to God. And you'll see that I include my journal entries in here, but the prayers, that was my hope, is when I was writing the prayers that I wrote in my journal, and then I started typing them, I thought, oh, these prayers can be for other people. And that was comforting to me. And so then to hear you say that just validates that. And I'm really happy to hear that. So thank you.
I'll be the first one to say prayer life is definitely something I need to work on. And it is one of those things, like I said, I don't feel like it's talked about much in the church. It's, we're given the Lord's Prayer and, pastors pray and all of that, but it's hard. And I find myself praying, kind of the same prayers, and you kind of get stuck in that, God, well, you already know everything. So just, what's on my heart, that sort of thing. And so I don't know, I just really was encouraged by the prayers and by just your heart in this, and in sharing the ins and the outs and the things that you did that did not align with God's will, and then the course correction back to God's will, and, back and forth, because I think that it's easy to be like, oh, this girl is, so good. She prays all the time. She journals, she talks to God, her life should be so good. But then it's no, you talk about yeah, I did this and this was not aligned with God's will for my life. And, you know, but you kept going back to him, which I think was like the most important thing is even when you sinned and even when you did things that you know that you shouldn't have done, you always came back to him instead of just letting that snowball.
Yes. Yes. And that's what I talk about too. On chapter 11 opens up with when I climbed the Saugatuck Dune, and chapter 11 is called The Journey Back to Him. And so I basically, while climbing this dune, I kept thinking to myself that climbing is a symbol of life. And when I was climbing up the dune, it became hard. And so I tried to go to the side thinking it would be easier. But it took me further away from going and continuing to go on to the top. However, I recognized that and I went back trying to get back on the straight path. But the one thing that I wanted to share is you try to get off the straight path and veer to the side path, feeling that it's safer. So you feel as though you're making more progress on your climb to the summit, but then you recognize that you're traveling to the side and no longer going up, getting further away from your destination. It's time to make a choice. Keep going, knowing the side path will continue to take you further away, or go back, refocus, and go back to climbing straight up. And I also talk about how sometimes you don't have to go all the way back. Sometimes all it takes is recognizing that you're off the path and believing you have the strength to resume climbing straight up. However, you don't realize right away that there might be unhealed wounds, losses, and grief from the other path. So it's a continuous cycle, but the one who will always be by your side, whatever path you take, is God. So it is what you're saying, Kenzie, of yes, we all have those moments, and sometimes those moments are those seasons, and that season could be a couple years or a few years. There is no time with God. And I say that God doesn't do time like us. So you will go through those grieving points and you have to lean into those. And I think with our culture and society, this is where I could become really passionate and this is the importance of this podcast and what God has placed on your heart, Kenzie, to get stories out there to share is we can't be scared to share our story. That's what the enemy wants. And God wants us to be free. And every time we go through these moments of that just feel so dark, that's what the enemy wants. He wants us to stay stuck in that. And we have to bring our stories to life and those moments in order for God to truly take hold of them and heal them. He knows them. And I one of my favorite parts in here too is even though I was at such a dark place, there was a crack of light. And I saw it, I felt it, and I just kept going. It took a long time, but that light, that crack grew and grew. And now it's the sun. I mean, the light is, I put on my Be the Light shirt today. It's just, there is always light. And sometimes it's hard to see, but it is always there.
100%. I think we just have to decide to look up instead of down. And we have to look for the light because it is always there. But our perspective is very important. And I think that's one of the most important things you can do is just try to see those, like you talked about earlier, seeing those penny moments, seeing the little things, even if it's your cup of coffee in the morning, if that's the only good part of your day, soak that in, find as much joy in that one thing that you can, and then, try to expand the light into other parts of your day.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we've talked a lot about the book. I want to ask you, just as you went through this excruciating betrayal and the trying to pick up the pieces afterwards, and I don't think we've touched on this, but this betrayal was 7 years long. Is that correct? There was a relationship for about 7 years. And so to put some context to the situation, this betrayal, it was over the course of 7 years that they were building this relationship, and then it ended. So 7 years is a lot of time to invest into something. And you talk in this book about having to really climb out of that. And I know we talked about that you share practical tips from the brokenness, but would love to just hear from you, what some of those picking up the pieces looked like, and maybe some of those like real raw emotions that happened right when it all came falling down.
Yeah. So, and that's a thing. Again, the more I've talked about it, it's become easier to say, but I was fearful of, and the listeners, you might think this too right now, but of sharing out that this was almost 7 years of talking to this person. And I want to reiterate, it was talking, but the last year or so was when I kind of fully committed to seeing if there was more. And I was talking to this person on the phone for hours. So it is a long period of time. The real raw emotions were, I call them my healing nights. And a lot of times I would do everything I could and be so stubborn not to have them. But because I knew that they would end up with a whole snotty box of Kleenexes next to me. And, I look back and I think it's been 7 years now in this. And I think of in the Bible, it talks about how for one sentence that Israelites were gone for 40 years and then 400 years. And it wasn't until this book came to fruition that I really understood that of this has taken time, and it was little bits and pieces. So some things that I've done, and it was scary, but I have at the beginning, it's not now, but I started to see a counselor, and now I have my life coach, and she's been with me through this journey. Surrounding myself with friends, and specifically friends who are believers and walk with the Lord. Part of something I've discovered along the way is I always say, part of our job on this earth that God gives us is to spread his light and love. And so that means being challenged to speaking and talking to people that might not be a believer. However, I also know how important it is to fill yourself with coming back to a solid friend group that pours into you and encourages you in a Christian faith-based way as well. So even looking back on my past 7 years, those relationships have grown. So getting myself into community, also sharing my story. Every time I have shared it, it's gotten easier, and trusting that God has it. He's gotten me through it. And that's what I say. This is, and I kind of stopped myself, and I didn't want to fix it in that moment. And he knew I would get to it. I actually don't call this, or I try not to, my book. I truly believe is the story God blessed me with to share to the world. So it's our book. And in saying that as well, I do connect that even for you, Kenzie, or, my friend Casey, anyone who reads it, it's their book too, because you can take little nuggets. So I really try. Every time I say my book, I literally get a ping because it is our book. And so he's been there every step of the way. And so, some other things I've done, I have journaled. And you were saying about those little things, those little gratitude moments. For the past so many years now, I start my journal every day with 3 things I'm grateful for. And it just gets you centered into what's important to start your day. And they could be as small as a cup of coffee or a smile. And I'm also, something that has helped me rebuild is this is not our eternal home. And so sharing our story, we shouldn't be afraid to do that. And I'm not saying I've always been like that, because I have. Like, I've been afraid. It's our stories make us who we are, but if I had not gone through all of this, I wouldn't be who I am, and I wouldn't be able to share his goodness and faithfulness and connect with people. And I think just that too, of connecting with people. I've met so many people along the way that I wouldn't have if I didn't do the work to get to this place. And it takes work. It is work, and it's hard work, and acknowledging that.
Yeah.
But you're going to be okay, and you're going to have moments.
For sure.
But you will be okay.
And I think there's an appropriate time to share. I think that we have to, I say we because, we talked to us before we hopped on the recording about, I had just shared my story on a podcast, and you have to get to a point where you can talk about it with the perspective that you have now, right? And so it's not good always to share it in the moment. It's not good to share it in the process. I think you have to have a certain perspective to be able to share it. And so this is not, go share everything with everyone.
No.
But take the time and learn from the lesson. And this was probably my favorite thing that you said in the whole book, because I've gotten many questions over my lifespan of, how I have the perspective or the attitude that I have about certain things. And it's literally what you said in your book somewhere. I don't know where it is. I'm going to paraphrase. This is not a direct quote, but that you view everything as a lesson. And so going through this catfishing journey was a lesson. It would be very easy to have victim mentality and to be like, this is something that happened to me. It, is my identity. It is my reason why I'm this way, so on and so forth. And I think that if you can view everything as a lesson and actually take the time to reflect, to learn something from that event, then that is one of the most powerful things you can do. It's, it's a lesson. It's not your identity.
Yeah. And you make me think of your mindset around things. So viewing it as a lesson, and maybe it's a small lesson, and not getting stuck in, oh, this happened to me. And it's okay to acknowledge that. I never want people to think like kind of what you said of, oh, she's written this book, she's in a healthier stage. I am at a healthy stage because I have not been healthy, and I've reflected on this, and I've changed parts of my mindset. I was on another podcast, and a friend of mine who listened to it, she said one thing that really stuck out to her was, I used the language on there, I get to do this. Like, we get to be alive. We get to go to our job. We get to travel. We get to have our moments of tears. And so while I was working out this morning, I was like, how can I approach this and remind ourselves, like, it's about your mindset, and you have a choice. You are in your own circle of control.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So going through this journey and, of betrayal and trying to rebuild after betrayal and trying to date again and all of those things, if you were speaking to someone, who may be going through a similar season that you were, just what is one piece of advice that you would leave someone with if they're in the middle of something that they can relate to from this podcast?
I mean, the first thing that came to mind is just keep going. One step at a time. That's all it takes. One step. And knowing that you really are not alone. So take each step, and you might not know what that step is. So reach out to me. I value connection and relationship. And sometimes we just need to talk to someone. But you also have to be open to being vulnerable. And that's hard sometimes. And that does take time, but just know it takes one step at a time.
Yep. I think that's very important, because if you look back on your life, it's like, how did I get here? And it was by a bunch of little steps. It wasn't, any big bounds and leaps. And so you look back when you get to the top of a mountain and like, how did I get here? A bunch of small little steps.
All the little steps. Yeah. And it's funny because I have a couple more podcasts that I'm going to be on, but when I was hiking Camelback, one of the other podcasters, she's going to have me talk about this, but there was a family, and the mom was saying, how much longer? And I said, oh, you have a ways to go, but just take it a step at a time. It's worth it. It's worth it.
Words for life. Words for life.
Because it is worth it. It is. The verse that is very well known, but it is something I have to remind myself of daily, of Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. He never said this life. He says it in the Bible that this life is not going to be easy. We read about it all throughout. Yep. But we have to trust that his plans are far greater than we can even ever imagine.
Amen. Amen, Stacey. Well, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story and for listening and being obedient to God and writing this book. And I know it's going to bless so many people. I know that I have so many things underlined and highlighted. And I think that there's so much in this book. There's amazing book recommendations other than just this book. There are practical tips. There are moments of reflection for you to journal. There are scripture after scripture, prayers on prayers, and just lessons to be learned, I think, and moments to be connected to her. I think I can relate to some of the things she talked about. And so if you want to, definitely go check out this book. And I just want to say thank you so much for writing it and for sharing it, because I know that it's going to bless so many people. And I just want to thank you for being here and being willing to share on this podcast and talk a little bit about your journey and how, some of your deepest times have led to your strongest faith in God.
Yeah, I love that.
For our listeners who maybe want to follow along your journey or want to buy your book or just see what you're up to and see how everything's going, where can they find you?
I'm on Facebook, and my main social media source, though, is Instagram. So it's my first and last name, Stacey Szczepanski. I also have a website, and I think all of this is going to be in the show notes, but it's just StaceySzzepanski.com. You can order the book as well through the website, and it will connect to me. And then also it's on Amazon. If you order through me, you get a few different things, special things that Amazon won't do. Kenzie and I know this because she found something in her book. But I also personalize. If you order through me, I personalize a message and sign it. But I also pray over your copy before sending it out. So yeah, those are some ways to purchase it. And yeah, there it is.
There she is.
Yes.
I love that photo on the front.
Yeah. And one of my good friends, even just the cover, just bringing the darkness to light and just the love. My friend Casey was the photographer for that. And that whole night was just a blessing, and every little detail of that cover so I'm praying over everyone listening that you take the time to unlock the love from within, to be set free and to grow closer in your relationship with God.
Go get it, guys. You won't regret it.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Kenzie. This was so much fun.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of My Valley, His Victory. If you or someone you know are interested in being on this podcast, please email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com.